Hi, everyone. Thanks for attending today's session. I'm going to wait a few more minutes to make sure we've got everyone before we get started. So hold tight. All right, I think we'll get started now. Seems like the number of attendees joining has slowed down. So thank you all for attending the third Q&A session for STEP, the Sustainable Transportation Equity Project. My name is Bree Swenson. I'm the project lead for at CARB. On the call also we have Jamie Tipton, who is the acting manager over STEP. We have Leslie Baruti, the CARB staff, who's taking notes for us today. And then we have Matthew Ong, also a CARB staff, who will be moderating the questions that we get live from you all today. So before we get started, I want to go over a handful of announcements, so bear with me. First, I want to acknowledge the disruptions to the economy, pressures on our healthcare systems, and community-led action on systemic racism that we have continued to witness over the last few months. In light of this, we especially appreciate the time that you're dedicating to address transportation equity in your communities right now. And we're committed to listening to and learning from community residents throughout California and working to address institutional and systemic racism in our work. So there are two types of grants under STEP, the Planning and Capacity Building Grant and the Implementation Grant. This teleconference is to answer questions specifically about the Implementation Grant. So if you're only interested in the Planning and Capacity Building Grant, that Q&A session was at 10 a.m. this morning. So I encourage you to look out for the question and answer document that will be a follow-up and cover everything that was covered in the Q&A session this morning. So as I mentioned, this is the third applicant teleconference, but the second one focused on the implementation grant. The first one that was on both grant types was on Tuesday, June 30th. The Q&A document that includes all the questions and answers that were covered in that first session is now up on STEP's Moving California webpage, and I included the link in the chat box. So you should all be able to see that in the bar on the right side of your screen. We also added the Q&A document as a handout to the GoToWebinar, so you should be able to see that directly as well. The deadline for both grants is August 31st, 2020 at 5 p.m. Pacific time. The implementation grant solicitation has a maximum of $20 million available. As you all know, the economy is not operating as it normally does, and the funding available for STEP has been impacted because of this. We have a public work group meeting this coming Friday, July 24th from 10 to 11 a.m. to hear public feedback on our proposed updated funding amounts based on new information about the funding available. We won't be able to confirm exactly how much money will be available for this program until after we receive that public feedback on our proposal on Friday. But we want to make it clear that it will likely be less than $20 million. The resulting determination after that public work group meeting will be posted on the STEP Moving California webpage, which is what I linked in the chat. I also want to share the link where you can see more information about that public work group meeting. So it's open to the public, anyone can join and hear our proposal for the funding splits for CARB's transportation equity projects, which includes STEP. The deadline to fill out the technical assistance survey to receive technical assistance for application support was 5 p.m. on July 15th. You are still welcome to submit a response to the survey if you want technical assistance, but since it's after the deadline, we cannot guarantee that the full scope of technical assistance services will be available to you. The survey is linked in the STEP solicitation and on the STEP Moving California webpage, so you can access the survey that way if you still want to fill it out. If you've already filled out the survey, you should have received an email from Richard France or Riley O'Brien of Estelano Advisors to start discussing your project. Estelano Advisors is the lead on our team of technical assistance providers for STEP. So in this Q&A session, first, I will read and respond to the questions we received over email before our question email in deadline of 5 p.m. on July 17th. Then I'll open it up to folks on the call who have additional questions. And if we have time after the questions on the call have been addressed, we'll respond to the questions we received after the email deadline of 5 p.m. on July 17th. So when we get to live questions, you can type your questions in the chat box, or you can raise your hand virtually using the GoToWebinar function so we can unmute you and you can ask your question out loud. You don't need to identify yourself when you ask a question. And if you don't want to identify yourself, it's better to type your question in the chat box because we will call your name when we unmute you to let you know that you're unmuted if you raise your hand. We may not be able to respond to some questions today. However, we will provide a written response and post a Q&A document for all the questions that we get. The solicitation says that the Q&A document will be posted within 3 business days or by early next week. We'll try to get that posted by that time, but it might take a little bit longer. As some of you are probably aware, it did for the first Q&A session. In the event of any differences between the written responses in the Q&A document and what was said today during the teleconference, the written responses take precedence over what was said, the verbal responses given today. Last thing, we're almost there, that I wanted to highlight is a solicitation error. So take note. I'm going to pull up the solicitation so I can show you. Actually, I don't have the right appendix pulled up, so I can show you where it is. This is Appendix C of the implementation grant solicitation. If you scroll down to the eligibility threshold section here, here's where the errors lie. So this section under STEP Community Map says The map identifies the STEP community boundary, the tentative location of each project, and the disadvantaged community or low-income community census tracts within the STEP community. And it also says at least 50% of the geographic area of the STEP community is disadvantaged or low-income community census tracts. The implementation grant is specifically focused on disadvantaged communities, not disadvantaged or low-income communities. So while not ineligible, the eligibility thresholds that we're looking for here are focused on the disadvantaged community. So this should, if we were to fix this in the solicitation, we would cross out or low-income community there, and that's what would need to change. That is still how we're going to evaluate the projects, and I will point to the place in the solicitation where this is stated correctly as well. So in page, there we go. On page 5 of the solicitation, maybe not page 5, oh, that was Appendix C. The STEP community is down here. We are. Okay. So here, this is page 20 of the implementation grant solicitation. It says at least 50% of the geographic area of the STEP community must be disadvantaged community census tracts. This is correct. So reference the solicitation for the correct information there. And similarly, at least 50% of the total proposal budget must fund projects located at least partially within the boundaries of the disadvantaged community census tracts that are located within the STEP community. The implementation grant is focused on disadvantaged communities, not disadvantaged or low-income communities. Okay, I think that about covers all of my announcements. So we will get started with answering the questions that we received over email. And I'm going to turn off my video so you can focus on the screen. All right. I'm going to pull up the sections of the solicitation that are relevant to the questions that we received, so you can see where exactly we're pulling from in the solicitation. We'll start with some questions about applicant eligibility. So the first question, we received 2 questions about this, so I'll read them both before responding. Can a school district be considered a nonprofit community-based organization and qualify as an applicant for an implementation grant? And then similarly, are school districts able to apply for funding? So per the eligible applicants section here, this is page 13, local governments are eligible as lead applicants. The definition of local governments can be found in Appendix A of the solicitation, so I'll pull that up. Local governments, for STEP's purposes, are any non-state public agency, including but not limited to cities, counties, councils of governments, air districts, transit agencies, school districts, and joint powers authorities. So school districts is included in the list of local governments. The next question, can a council of governments serving as the Metropolitan Planning Organization and the Regional Transportation Planning Agency for a region apply for STEP funds as the lead applicant and pass through the funds to 4 local qualifying member agencies to fund STEP eligible projects? So on page 13 of the implementation grant solicitation, we address this, page 13, and crosses over to page 14. So the solicitation says, if an entity that would be the lead applicant does not have the administrative capacity to assume this role, they may be a sub-applicant and partner with another entity applying as the lead applicant. In this scenario, all lead applicant requirements would still apply. The lead applicant would still enter into a grant agreement with CARB and assume responsibility and accountability for the use and expenditure of received STEP funds. But the partnership could be set up so that the lead applicant supports the grant administratively and the sub-applicant leads project implementation. So here's another set of questions that I'll answer at once. Can a lead applicant apply for more than one application? For example, can City X's Department of Y apply as a lead and then another department, let's call them Z, apply as a lead for another applicant? Or can there only be one application for from the same city? And then a similar question, is a city allowed to submit more than one grant application from different departments? The answer is STEP has no limitations on the number of proposals that may be submitted by a single applicant or from a single community. The next question is also a two-parter. We want to ensure that we meet the expectations of a community-based organization as a lead applicant. As a nonprofit organization whose entire team lives in our city and is focused on transportation equity, we believe that we do. We are also aware that perhaps CARB has a different perspective on the concept of community-based organization. Can we discuss lead applicant eligibility? Before I continue on with the second similar question, I'll just note that in an open solicitation, CARB cannot discuss any one applicant's eligibility with, specific to that applicant. So that is something that the technical assistance providers may be able to help with. But I would refer you to the information in the solicitation for the best information about if you are eligible. So before we get into that, the other question that's similar is, if the focus area of an organization is a specific city or county and the STEP project is within that metropolitan area, does the organization meet the requirement of a community-based organization? So I'm going to point you to Appendix A, where we have the definition of a community-based organization for STEP's purposes. Here we are. So a community-based organization is a nonprofit organization that is place-based with an explicit geographic focus area that includes the STEP community. The organization's staff members, volunteers, or board members should reside in the community where the project is located. The organization must have a demonstrated record of at least 1 full year providing transportation or equity-related services in the STEP community. To qualify as a lead applicant, a community-based organization must have tax-exempt status with the Internal Revenue Service under Internal Revenue Code Section 501, be tax-exempt under California state law, have at least 1 year of incorporation prior to proposal submittal, and be based in California or have at least 1 full-time staff person based in California. It is up to the applicant to determine if they meet this definition of a community-based organization and are thus eligible to apply as a lead applicant. Final question on applicant eligibility that we received. We have managed transportation equity planning in our city for more than 5 years and are the lead organization on a big transportation project. We believe that we have significant capabilities to coordinate and manage a multi-collaboration effort, leveraging other public and private investment and scaling up several very high-profile mobility projects in disadvantaged communities. Do we meet the criteria for providing transportation services? So STEP has no specific criteria for the partners that will actually provide transportation services as part of a STEP-funded project. I will point you to the criteria that I think are most relevant to this question. This is on page 15 of the implementation grant solicitation. Here, the proposal must demonstrate the ability of each sub-applicant to support the lead applicant and fulfill their roles on specific projects or project elements on time and within the budget. A statement of qualifications must be included for each sub-applicant that demonstrates that they have successfully implemented projects or project elements similar in scope or size in California within the last 7 years. So this could apply to the transportation service elements of a project or any other projects or project elements that you would like funded under STEP. So I have a few questions about process. The first question is, what organization is providing technical assistance on CARB's behalf? So as I mentioned earlier, that organization is a consulting firm called Estelano Advisors. They're the lead on the team of technical assistance providers that are available to support STEP applicants and recipients. And then there are a number of other providers that are supporting Estelano Advisors. The next question is, the solicitation says up to $22 million is available for this program, with the implementation having $20 million. Is this correct? I understand this ceiling is subject to change due to the COVID emergency. So our answer is yes, that is what the solicitation says. There are $22 million available at most in total for the Sustainable Transportation Equity Project, and we set aside 20 million of that 22 million specifically for the implementation grant. As I mentioned earlier, on July 24th, so this coming Friday, CARB will hold a public work group meeting to determine the available funding for STEP based on all of the funding that's now available. You can see the CARB's website where I posted the link to that earlier for additional information about how to attend that public work group meeting. When we have the final funding amounts for both the planning and capacity building grant and the implementation grant solicitations, we will update the documents and our websites accordingly. So all of that will be updated as soon as the information is, the funding amount is determined with public feedback. The next question is, it is also mentioned that 1 to 3 awards will be made on the implementation side. Do you have a ballpark range on the amount available for each award? Our answer is no. The amount of funds available for each award will be dependent on the funding needs of the highest ranking proposals that are submitted. And then the last question in this section, would grant submissions from one city compete against each other? Yes, all implementation grant proposals will be scored against each other. All right, now we get into project eligibility. So I'm going to pull up Appendix E, which is our project eligibility appendix, and has charts with all of the eligible projects listed. So first question is, are solar carports eligible costs? Say a carport with solar and charging stations for electric vehicles? Short answer is yes. Reference Appendix E here. So I will point you to down here under zero emission readiness projects to support publicly accessible clean transportation. You know, we have some elements for this, could include renewable energy generation and storage to support zero emission transportation and public zero emission vehicle charging or refueling infrastructure. It may be dependent on the characteristics of the solar carports, but charging infrastructure and renewable energy generation projects would both fall under this project type. Next question, can a portion of the funding be used for paving for new bicycle infrastructure? The short answer again is yes. If you look at Appendix E, active transportation is the first strategy listed here, and here we are. New bikeways and networks would fall under the active transportation strategy defined here. There we are. The next question, are the implementation grants offered through this program Climate Action Plan eligible? So this program is focused on transportation equity. Again, reference Appendix E to see whether you think your project fits within the lists identified. Planning projects would fall here under, one more down, here, the planning and community engagement strategy. So these list the requirements for the planning projects. All of the eligible projects identified under this strategy are focused on planning and community engagement specifically to support clean transportation. That is the focus of this program. Is the STEP program supportive of buses and school districts building infrastructure for non-petroleum diesel? Again, reference Appendix E. STEP focuses on zero emission vehicles and infrastructure per the eligible project type, zero emission readiness projects to support publicly accessible clean transportation, which is on page E6. I referenced it earlier. So we're focusing on zero emission projects here. And then last question about project eligibility. Is there an opportunity to include some planning activities within an implementation grant? And I'll just say yes. I showed you where the planning and community engagement strategy was in this document. So that includes a list of eligible planning projects. All right, moving on to our question about resource contributions. The question is, can the 20% match come from any program or funding source available, or are there restrictions? So I'm going to pull up Appendix G, resource contribution eligibility. This has all the information you need about the eligible resource contributions. It specifically outlines the restrictions regarding stacking funds, which is using multiple sources of funding, for example, STEP funds and then other resource contributions, to fund a single project or proposal. So resource contributions must meet the following requirements. At least half of the resource contribution requirement, for example, at least 10% of the value of the requested STEP funds, must be met through use of non-California Climate Investments funds. STEP funds used for vehicle purchases may not be stacked with HVIP funds. That's the Heavy Duty Vehicle Incentive Project, which are also used for vehicle purchases. And then resource contributions may not be combined with STEP funds to exceed an item's purchase price. So those are the things you have to take into consideration when figuring out the sources that will be used to meet that resource contribution requirement. All right, next set of questions is about the STEP community. The first question is, we are talking with government entities and community partners about a pilot with related projects that would benefit and would all be within a specific city or county. Does this metropolitan area meet the requirement for a contiguous boundary? To answer this question, I'm just going to pull up the STEP community definition, which is again in Appendix A. So we can all look at the same thing. This is where it says that the STEP community must be represented by a contiguous geographic boundary. So if the city or county that comprises the STEP community has one continuous boundary, then it would meet the contiguous requirement of a STEP community. So you can refer to Appendix A for the complete definition of the STEP community and to determine whether or not the community that you're thinking of meets this requirement. And then our final question is there some flexibility in the contiguous requirement to allow for a city to apply for an implementation grant that would include two parts of a district that is separated by another city, even though it's not technically contiguous? So this is a situation where someone wants to have a community, a part of a city identified as a community, but that part of the community is, or that community is separated by another city, so it's not contiguous. We don't have any flexibility about this contiguous requirement. The STEP community must align with the definition here in Appendix A to be eligible for funding. If an applicant wanted to apply for funding for two separate parts of that district or those two separate communities, the applicant would have to apply for two separate implementation grants. All right, so those were all the questions that we received before the email in deadline of July 17th at 5 p.m. So now we'll take some questions live. So remember, you can chat them in or you can raise your hand virtually and Matthew will call on you. So we'll start with in-person questions if anyone wants to raise their hand and ask a question verbally.
Yeah, and just to know that, please just raise your hand if you have a question that you haven't already typed in to the questions box. If you've already typed it in, we will address it here. Right now, we don't have anyone with their hands raised, but if you do raise your hand, we will get to you. And so I think we'll move towards the written typed in questions now.
Sounds good.
The first question For workforce development, since there are no electric vehicle pickup trucks yet on the market, can STEP funds be used for a hybrid or low emission truck?
So I'm going to pull up Appendix E, project eligibility, and go down to the project element requirements here. Here we are. These are this first section here, and on page E14 is the list of requirements for the light, medium, and heavy duty vehicles specifically funded by STEP. The vehicles must be zero emission if they're funded by STEP.
Next question. What do you anticipate in terms of cuts to the amount of funding available for the two programs, or I guess the two types of grants?
I'm not sure if I'm fully understanding that question, but you know, that depends on the public feedback we receive based on our proposal. Right now, you know, if it's any indication, the current split that we had before we knew what funding would actually be available was $20 million for the implementation grant and $2 million for the planning and capacity building grant. So I don't think I can say any more at this time, but you can tune in on Friday at 10 to 11 a.m. to learn more about our specific proposal to the public.
Next question. Can a church or other religious institution apply for STEP funding as a community-based organization if they meet requirements of a community-based organization?
I think I will have to get back to you on that. It's, you know, it's a good start to meet the requirements of a community-based organization. I know that there might be some state laws that we have to make sure that we're following as well. So we'll put that into the Q&A document, the answer to that question.
Next question. What is the required proposed program duration? In other words, if we are awarded, how long should we run the proposed service?
So I'm going to answer that question in maybe two ways. The first is logistically. I'm going to pull up our timeline here. Here we are. So the grant term and all of the funds must be spent before March 31st, 2025. So take that into consideration when determining what how the proposal will operate and how the funds will be used. That is the maximum. So we don't have any preference for how long a project, how long a grant term will be, but the maximum has to be March 31st, 2025. So a grant term could run, you know, any length of time in between that. The other way I'll answer that, in case this is what you were getting at, is with the longevity and lessons learned section. So this is starts on page 30 of the implementation grant solicitation. We want to note that you know, STEP funded projects are intended to catalyze clean transportation solutions that can continue to address communities' transportation needs beyond the grant term. You know, we aren't looking for short-term solutions here. So you will be scored, or your proposal will be scored on the longevity of the proposal. So how each project will remain fiscally sustainable and continue to provide benefits to the STEP community residents beyond the grant term. And, you know, if the service discontinues, how those capital investments will continue to serve the community as well. I can't say, you know, all proposals will be scored against each other. So I can't say how, like, there's no minimum threshold here, but it will be factored into the proposal that ends up receiving the funds.
Next question. Can you please give explicit guidance on expected word counts for the responses in the application? The space given in the application without adjusting row height seems to suggest 70 to 150 word counts per response.
Yeah, so CARB cannot provide any specific recommendations outside of what is already stated in the solicitation about how to put together a proposal or fill out the proposal template. So the main instruction we have about that in the solicitation is actually in the proposal template, Appendix B. It's an Excel spreadsheet. I'm not going to download it right now, but in the instructions tab of this spreadsheet, it says that applicants should try to fit their responses to the questions in the solicitation into the space provided in the proposal template. However, applicants are allowed to include attachments with more detail if they feel that it is necessary to fully or accurately answer a specific question. Applicants should include the file name of any attachment submitted in the relevant responses box of the proposal template.
The next question, if we plan to subcontract multiple CBOs for specific projects under the sub-applicant, how should we represent that in the application? Should they be listed as community partners?
So there is no limit to the number of sub-applicants that may be listed per project or per proposal. So I think applicants should refer to Appendix A, here we are, for the definitions of a sub-applicant, that one's right here, and then community partner, which is above. I'll just note some of the main differences. If the entity will be responsible for implementing project or project elements funded through STEP, like so, then they would be considered a sub-applicant. And then I'll scroll up to the definition of a community partner. If an entity is not responsible for implementing projects funded through STEP like the lead applicants and sub-applicants are, but will serve as a key stakeholder and representative of the STEP community during decision making, then that entity should be identified as a community partner.
And then as a follow-up to that question, can we list more than 10 community partners?
Yes, if you have more than 10 community partners, I think this question is because the proposal template, I think, only has rows for 10 community partners. You have two options. You can add more rows to the proposal template spreadsheet to list those community partners out, or you can attach another document to your proposal that includes a list of the additional community partners.
Next question, can you provide any updated guidance or justification around food and childcare expenses being ineligible, but still highly prioritized in the guidelines for public engagement?
So all we can say is CARB lacks authority at this time to allow funding for food, drink, refreshments, and childcare. That can be funded through resource contributions, though, so we highly encourage that if important for your community engagement.
Next question, with less funding for implementation, less than $20 million, is CARB thinking about awarding 1 to 3 applicants still, or will they consider changing the amount of awardees to either less or more?
For the implementation grants, it still stands that with less funding in total, CARB will look at awarding, 1 to 3 implementation grant proposals. Again, this is dependent on the highest scoring projects and how much proposals and how much funding they ask for. So you can see, I'll just show you here in page, it's really here, page 41, is that it? 42. We have some information about the selection process, so you can get a sense this selection process is unlikely to change even with a different funding amount available.
Next question. Is the fixed route transit strategy limited to public and mass transit? For example, could electric vehicle charging equipment be installed at public lots qualify as a fixed route strategy if the intended users are residents in the disadvantaged communities, traveling in either their personal vehicles to commute to work, or rideshares bringing people to work, or government fleet vehicles if they are driving a fixed route to get to the chargers?
The fixed route transit is specifically for shared public transit. So generally, mostly buses, you know, rail, I guess, also would qualify, and there might be some other vehicle types that would qualify under fixed route transit. I'll let applicants determine that. But you can get a sense of what's included in fixed route transit from this description. Projects such as transit station improvements, transit right-of-way improvements, transit operations improvements, transit passes, and improvements to increase accessibility of transit. So I will note that fixed route transit is a strategy that must be quantifiable. So there must be greenhouse gas emission reductions from a fixed route transit project. You would enter those into, you would calculate those GHG greenhouse gas emissions from the benefits calculator, which is in Appendix I. So if, where are we? If you were trying to do a fixed route transit project, it would need to be quantifiable, fit within that benefits calculator framework. The only other thing that I'll note is that, so, you know, if we're talking about public charging stations, that is unlikely to qualify as fixed route transit strategy, where public transit or public charging stations fit in is really here under zero emission readiness projects to support publicly accessible clean transportation.
And just to build off of that, I believe for fixed routes that you would have to know the exact route path for each individual vehicle for that to be considered a fixed route, which may be difficult for personal vehicles.
Right. Thanks, Matthew.
Next question. Please confirm if right-of-way acquisition is eligible as part of a sidewalk implementation project. Page E-12 shows right-of-way as eligible, but not on page E-14.
All right, let me, E-12, acquisition of right-of-way is eligible. Let's see what E-14 says. Right-of-way. Yeah, I understand how that might not be clear. We'll take some time to clarify that, and we'll provide a better response in the Q&A, in the follow-up Q&A document. I don't want to say the wrong thing.
All right, we'll move on to the next question then. Is STEP considering doing partial awards? Would scope of work, would scopes be allowed to decrease in such a case to match reduced available funding?
Sure. Let me pull up the relevant part of the solicitation for that. Here we are. It's actually right here. So page 42, I believe, of the implementation grant solicitation says, CARB retains the right to remove discrete elements of proposals selected for funding that CARB determines to be ineligible, or to reduce the scope of a proposal to use any remaining funds. So, you know, that's our policy on portions of proposals for funding. I will also note one other thing here under the project eligibility section. on page 10, we do say that applicants are encouraged to demonstrate how projects and project elements may be prioritized for funding in case the full proposal cannot be funded. So, that will be a helpful thing for applicants to do for us when we're looking at awards.
Next question, can land acquisition cost count towards the 20% match funding?
Let me reference Appendix G again for the resource contributions. So in Appendix G, we have a table that includes a list of eligible resource contributions and the documentation that we need to see for each resource contribution. Donated land for infrastructure must only account for a maximum of 25% of the total resource contribution. So we do have limits on land acquisition.
Next question, can a lead applicant apply for more than one application? For example, can City X's Department of Y apply as a lead, and then another department for that city apply as a lead for another applicant? Or can there only be one application from the same city?
Yeah, we have no restrictions on the number of applications we'll receive and review from any one city or any one community. So that's for, submitting multiple implementation grants proposals, or for submitting an implementation grant proposal and a planning and capacity building grant proposal.
Next question, could you please clarify if watercraft are eligible to apply? And if so, what vehicle type should be selected in the STEP benefits calculator tool?
Sure, so I'm gonna go to Appendix E again, a project eligibility. So watercraft are not specifically identified as eligible in this appendix. I will note that as it says, where is it? Up here a little bit. Projects that are not on the eligible or ineligible lists may be determined to be eligible at CARB's sole discretion. So we would need more details to determine if the watercraft that you're thinking of would fit within the existing benefits calculator, Appendix I. If the project does not fit in the benefits calculator, it cannot be quantified for the purposes of this solicitation. I'll also note that the technical assistance providers can help applicants quantify greenhouse gas emission reductions using the benefits calculator, so highly recommend that you work with the technical assistance providers on that.
And then we got a follow-up question to the land acquisition question. What if the land is not donated? Would the land acquisition cost still count towards that 20% match fund?
Yeah, that's a good question. Let's see what we say about, so the proposal may identify resource contributions that are not listed in the table below. CARB maintains the discretion to allow or disallow additional types of resource contributions. So that determination will be made after the proposal is submitted and when the proposal is being reviewed.
Next question. For the community partner definition, how does CARB define an equity project? Quotes around equity.
I think I'm going to pull up that. Oh, we're right here. Perfect. So I think, oh, actually, that's not the right place, huh? It's here, and then we talked about that in the sub-applicant section. tell me if this is not what you're referencing. Actually, maybe you can, Matthew, can you repeat that question again, or maybe?
Yeah, to repeat, for the community partner definition, how does CARB define an equity project?
Okay, so yeah, maybe whoever submitted that question can elaborate a little bit, because unless I'm going blind, I'm not seeing the reference to equity projects specifically in this community partner definition. I will note that what I was initially thinking of was something where we said that, oh, it's probably a community-based organization. That might be what you're thinking of. The organization must have a demonstrated record of at least 1 full year providing transportation or equity-related services in the STEP community. So hopefully that's what you're thinking of, but correct me if I'm wrong. In this description of a community-based organization, we will leave it up to the applicants to determine whether they meet this criteria and whether you've provided transportation or equity-related services to the community that you're proposing to serve. You know, I will also note that this is not all aspects of equity, but we do have a definition of transportation equity, so that can help give you a sense of what we can, how we think about equity. Listed here, and it's also in the solicitation itself. So for purposes of STEP, transportation equity is when a community's transportation system provides accessible, affordable, environmentally sustainable, reliable, and safe transportation options to all residents, in particular those that have been disproportionately impacted by pollution or lack access to services. Transportation equity is intrinsically linked to access to economic opportunities and occurs when community residents have the power to make decisions about their transportation systems. So that's transportation focused, and the community-based organization does not have to be transportation focused, but that can help you understand the way we define equity with a transportation lens.
And then someone needs to leave the call soon, so I'll get to their question now. Can subsidies for purchase of personally owned micromobility be covered, similar to transit passes, for example?
So Appendix E, again, I'll reference. Let's see if I can find it. Active transportation subsidies, I think, is the place where that would fall. It's under mode shift, the mode shift strategy. And one of the elements we have eligible here is vouchers to incentivize active transportation or vouchers to purchase personal zero emission micromobility vehicles. So I believe that covers what you're asking about.
And then next question, can the use of public real estate, such as on-street parking spaces, furniture zone space, and grid power, be considered a resource contribution? If so, are there standards by which a monetary value is set?
So I think the only thing we've covered about that in the solicitation is in the list of eligible resource contributions in Appendix G. Down at the bottom here, we have lost parking meter revenue at on-street charging stations for shared user vehicles. So I think that's the only, that might give you an indication of a way you could try to quantify the value of a resource contribution related to, street parking. I don't think that we have that addressed any other place. So again, I would point you to this line up above. You may identify resource contributions that are not listed in this table, and CARB staff will have to determine whether to allow or disallow those types of resource contributions in review of the proposal.
Next question. What is the public proposal that will be presented on Friday?
So I don't think that the information that we're proposing is publicly available, so I can't say anything about what we'll be proposing on Friday, but the overall, the proposal is about the funding split for the CARB's different transportation equity projects from fiscal year 1920. Now that we have a better sense of how much funding was made by the 4 cap and trade auction proceeds from fiscal year 1920, we have a better sense of how much funding is actually available for the different transportation equity projects. So on Friday, we'll be covering what our proposal is for each of the for funding each of the transportation equity projects within CARB's low carbon transportation program, and that will include the proposal for funding available for STEP for both the implementation grant and for the planning and capacity building grant. Again, if you can't attend on Friday and are curious, the link here, the link that I sent earlier for the low carbon transportation investments and equip meetings and workshops has information about the upcoming meeting on Friday here, the webinar registration. An agenda will be added that might have some information available that you can look at. And then once the funding amounts are actually determined, we will update all of the STEP solicitation materials and websites with that relevant information.
Next question. Do all of the technology providers need to be confirmed upfront? What kind of flexibility is acceptable given that mobility and community needs are evolving rapidly?
Sure. So, you know, I guess one thing I'll say is we have Appendix C here, the proposal components and eligibility thresholds. This, and specifically this table here in section 3, eligibility thresholds, lists all of the minimum requirements that a proposal needs to meet to be able to move on to be scored. That's the next step of the review process. So I would take a look at these eligibility thresholds and make sure that your proposal meets all of these eligibility thresholds at a minimum. Beyond that, I can't really say, these eligibility thresholds are our minimum standard. Beyond that, the scoring criteria, so pull those up as well, that's Appendix D. The scoring criteria list out, everything that will be scored in the proposal, so you can take a look at that. But I think I've said this before in this session, the proposals will be scored against each other, so we don't have a good sense at this time, since we haven't seen any proposals, what you would need to do to be competitive. So reference those two appendices. Yeah. If I think of anything else to say about that, I'll add it into the Q&A document.
And then the next question, if a separate project application was state or federally funded, can that separate project be folded into this STEP application as a subcomponent? For example, a microtransit project gets folded into a STEP application for a shared mobility program.
I'm not sure if I completely understand how that would work. I'm assuming that's related to being a resource contribution. So if that's the case, I will pull up too many tabs. Pull up the information about a resource contribution here in Appendix G. Resource contributions may be used to cover project costs or direct grant implementation costs. So you can consider how any resource contributions from federal funding or other state funding would be used to cover the project costs for the projects that you're planning on implementing through STEP. The other thing I'll say is that STEP projects are intended to STEP is intended to fund new projects or expansion projects for the most part that achieve new greenhouse gas emission reductions, not emission reductions that already would have happened. So the benefits calculator is created so that we can just quantify the benefits coming from any new services that are offered through STEP. So that's also probably something to consider.
Next question. Can you say anything about what you are looking for regarding how long you would like responses to questions be in the application? The provided materials makes it pretty hard to guess what the program is looking for.
Yeah, we can't give any recommendations outside of what we already say in the solicitation. So, about how to put together a proposal or fill out the proposal template. So I don't think we can say any more about that. One thing to note is that the technical assistance providers can support applicants and might have some sense of their own of what a good proposal would look like, though obviously none of us can guarantee funding for any single proposal.
Yeah, and like you said previously, if a response runs longer than the given space, then they could put it in a clearly labeled appendix document, correct?
Definitely. Yeah, and that's all in the proposal template instructions tab, which is Appendix B.
Next question. Can a project implement different services over time that are not necessarily concurrent? Can multiple technology or services be engaged over the project term, as some providers are hesitant to commit to multi-year commitments?
The short answer is yes. I don't think that we have any restrictions on that. I think the one thing I would point to in the solicitation that might address that is, again, this longevity scoring criteria. Past it. Right here, starts on page 30 of the implementation grant solicitation, and says that STEP-funded projects are intended to catalyze clean transportation solutions that can continue to address communities' transportation needs beyond the grant term. So, take a look at this part of the solicitation, and I would encourage you to identify how you would respond to this question 23 here with that type of proposal.
The next question, can more than one sub-applicant be listed for a single project?
More than one sub-applicant. Well, let me rephrase that because I don't want to give the wrong impression. So there can only be one lead applicant on the proposal. So actually, let me pull up a diagram that may or may not be useful to you. There can only be one lead applicant. There can be multiple community partners and multiple sub-applicants. We have no restriction on, so if there are multiple projects or multiple project elements within a proposal, we have no restrictions on how many sub-applicants or community partners can be involved in a project or a project element, but only one lead applicant, and then there can be more sub-applicants or community partners. Hopefully that makes sense.
The next question, if we haven't heard from someone at Estelano Advisors yet, when should we expect to hear from them by? So just to kind of paraphrase that question, what is kind of the turnaround time for Estelano Advisors to get back to someone?
I'm not quite sure, but I would guess somewhere around, if you haven't heard back from them within a week, you are welcome to email to fill out the survey again, or to email staff@arb.ca.gov. I would, also check your, junk or spam folders in case, it's for some reason it went into that folder because it was an unknown email.
And then the last question that we have right now, if we signed up for technical assistance for planning, but have decided to do the implementation grant, can we change our initial submission?
I will say, yes, but there's no reason to actually change your survey responses. So the technical assistance survey responses are really just for the technical assistance provider team to get a sense of the where different potential applicants are at with their proposal development process and what they're thinking of for their proposals. The survey responses by no means are restrict what you can do in the future. So I would make sure to communicate with the technical assistance providers about what the proposal that you want to submit, so they can make sure to give you the assistance that's relevant for your proposal.
And then we got another question in. It seems a proposal must include a clean transportation project and a supporting project. Do the two need to be related, or can they fulfill different parts of a non-motorized plan?
That is correct. There needs to be at least one clean transportation strategy implemented and at least one supporting strategy implemented. So I'm going to start by taking your question literally and saying, asking what needs to be done. And that's where I would reference the eligibility thresholds in Appendix C. This is section 3 of Appendix C. Where are we? And here, the requirements for the projects identified are listed here. So you see it's a pretty minimal requirements for the projects identified. For the eligibility thresholds, those are our minimum requirements to move on to scoring. Then you get to, I pulled that up twice, that's why. Then you get to Appendix D, the scoring criteria, and that can help you understand how those projects that you identified will actually be scored. And so under the scoring criteria here, one of the scoring criteria we have is that proposed projects are integrated and connected with each other in a manner that maximizes the ability to address community residents' transportation needs. So that's just something to flag, something to consider as you're figuring out what those projects will look like.
And that is all the questions that we have at this time.
Okay, we'll wait a couple minutes and see if any other questions come in. If they don't, we'll go ahead and address any questions that we received over email after the deadline.
Oh, okay. We got some more questions in.
Lovely.
First one is on-demand microtransit run by a public transit agency not considered a strategy under fixed route transit?
Let me pull up Appendix E, our favorite appendix. So fixed route transit, I guess I'm operating on the assumption that on-demand microtransit operated by a public transit agency is not literally on a fixed route, that it is on demand, meaning the route changes based on who's requesting the service and who's riding the service. In that scenario, it doesn't matter what entity is operating the service, if it's a public transit agency or a private mobility provider, that microtransit service is considered to be a shared mobility strategy listed here. If it's, I'm not sure exactly how this would work, but if it's a microtransit service that's on demand, but for some reason, goes on the same path every day regardless, that could be fixed route transit.
And then another question. Can you please expand on your answer regarding potential partial awards for projects? It would be helpful to know if the scope of a project can be reduced due to a partial award and what that would look like.
I'm not sure if we know exactly what it would look like because it's dependent on the proposals that we get in. Maybe I'll just try to restate in a better way what the solicitation says here. Here we are. So there are basically two scenarios in which the solicitation gives CARB the ability to only fund portions of a proposal. One is if an element or a project within a proposal is determined by CARB to be ineligible, so then we would remove that project and funds associated with that project from the award. That obviously would be communicated with the awardee before moving forward. And then similarly, so the way the scoring process works is proposals are scored, and then the highest scoring proposal receives the funding that they are eligible for. Then if there's additional funding available with whatever's left, we would then look to scoring the next highest proposal, or to awarding the next highest proposal. If there's remaining funds available after that, we just go down the list and continue to award funding to the next highest scoring proposal based on the funds available. It probably won't work out exactly evenly where the highest scoring proposal, the lowest scoring proposal that receives funds asks for exactly the amount of funds that we have left. That would be a beautiful life, but I don't think that's going to happen. So if that's the case, we offer that proposal the funding that we have available, whatever's left, and then we first typically would try to figure out a way to have that whole proposal, have that whole project move forward. If that's not possible, we would discuss with the applicant if there was a way to reduce the scope of the proposal to use any remaining funds, but that would be a discussion that would have to happen between CARB and the applicant. And of course, I just want to note that CARB has the sole discretion to not offer those funds to a proposal, carry the remaining funds over to another fiscal year, or direct funding to another project in the funding plan, as stated in this paragraph here. So hopefully that helps a little bit that's pretty much all we know at this point. It's really determined, will be determined by the context of the proposals that we receive.
And then just making another point, Bree, I think in the previous teleconference, you kind of alluded to this, that it would be helpful in applications to kind of have some segmentation or a way to see, make clear where these partial projects can be made, or what parts of the projects can be funded independently of other parts, just to assist with that partial award decision on our end. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think the way that we have that set up in the solicitation is, and I referenced this earlier when this first question first came up, on page, I want to say 9, I could be wrong. I was wrong, I think. Oh no, maybe I wasn't. Under project eligibility, we say that applicants are encouraged to demonstrate how projects and project elements may be prioritized for funding in case the full proposal cannot be funded. You know, off the top of my head, the minimum way that we ask for that in the actual proposal template is when you list out the projects, we ask you to list them by priority for funding.
And those are all the questions at this time again.
Okay, thanks. So then I will move on to answering the last handful of questions that we haven't yet covered and that were emailed in a little bit late. If in the meantime you have other questions, feel free to keep chatting them in or raise your hand so we can hear someone else's voice besides my own and Matthew's. And then if we don't have any other questions after this, we'll end early. So we received a couple questions about letters of support. I'm going to pull up the relevant part of the implementation grant solicitation for this. The question is, what is the purpose of the requirement for a lead applicant to submit a letter of support for the application they are submitting? So per page 14 of the implementation grant solicitation here, the lead applicant's letter of support is the place in their proposal where they should go, where they should do all of the following. So they should define their contribution to the proposal, identify their role in developing the partnership structure, express a commitment to implementing the proposal if funded, highlight any strategies they're currently implementing or plan to implement that will support the proposed STEP-funded project, and identify any resource contributions they are committed to providing. And then the other question about letters of support is, do you expect letters of support from elected officials and supporting agencies that are not technically a sub-applicant or a community partner? And our answer is no. We only expect letters of support from lead applicants, sub-applicants, and community partners, as stated in the instructions tables in this solicitation and in the applicant eligibility section. Let's see, we have a question. Do you know if our organization, whatever the name of the organization, whatever that is eligible for the CARB STEP grant as a lead agency? So I'm going to interpret that as a lead applicant. And so I would just point you again to Appendix A, acronyms and definitions, for the definition of a lead applicant. The definition of a lead applicant and the definition of the types of entities that are eligible as lead applicants, which are community-based organizations, federally recognized tribes, and local governments. So those three types of entities also have definitions in Appendix A. You can look at each of them and determine if you meet any of those definitions. And then the last question I don't think that we've covered here is about the STEP community. I'll go down to that section. We are. So in the grant solicitation, I think this is page 20. Yeah, includes the instructions to submit a STEP community proposed map and describes it as a map shapefile right here. This implies a GIS readable electronic file as opposed to a graphic visual map. Is a GIS shapefile required, or is a conventional graphic map or set of maps acceptable? So the solicitation is asking for a GIS shapefile so that we can verify the geographic area requirements that are outlined earlier on page 20 here. So we understand that all applicants may not have the resources available to readily map their STEP community in GIS, so to create a shapefile. So we've specifically asked the technical assistance providers to help with this. So the technical assistance providers can help applicants map their STEP community boundary to make sure that we can verify that these geographic requirements have been met. So I believe those are all the questions that we hadn't previously covered. Last call for any other questions that you all have.
Yeah, we just had 2 more questions come in. The first one, if you do not expect letters of support from elected officials and other city agencies participating in the grant proposal, would these letters of support assist the grant proposal and the way it is reviewed?
I would direct you back to Appendix D, the scoring criteria. This has the full list of what's going to be scored. We're not going to score anything beyond what is listed here in the scoring criteria. So anything that is not on this list will not be factored into the review process, the scoring process.
And then another question, is it okay if one of these sub-applicants provides the 20% match fund and the lead applicant does not provide any match funding?
Short answer is yes. We have no requirements in terms, let me pull back up the resource contribution if I can find it. Oh goodness, here we are. We have no restrictions on who needs to apply those resource contributions or where those resource contributions come from. You know, in the letter of support for whichever applicant, sub-applicant, et cetera, community partner, or say probably likely applicant or sub-applicant, supplies those resource contributions, that's where we need the information about and confirmation of what that resource contribution is. So that's in those letters of support. But it's okay if we get the letter of support from the lead applicant that says we're not supplying a resource contribution and that 20% is all coming from one of the sub-applicants and is identified in their letter of support.
All right, next question. What do you expect for the required letter of support from the lead applicant? Is this more like a cover page?
I think the only thing I can do is point you back to this. I don't want to repeat myself too much. That's the sub-applicant one. They are pretty similar. This is, you know, an attachment to the overall proposal. The letter of support should identify all of these, should include all of these components. We'll be looking to make sure that it includes all of these components. They're all important for us to make sure that the lead applicant is committed to the project, has committed a resource contribution. If they've committed one, that's been identified and verified. So, you know, you can kind of structure that letter of support however you wish to, as long as it has these components.
And then next question, is there any minimum project funding amount?
No, there is not.
And those are all the questions.
All right. Maybe I'll give you guys one more minute just to make sure we've covered everything, and then I'll wrap up with a few reminders. Okay, I think that was enough time. Turn back on.
Yeah, no more questions.
No more?
Yeah, no more questions still.
Okay, great. Thanks, Matthew. So turning back on my video to close out today, wrap up with a few reminders and a few notes about the what's upcoming for the STEP solicitation. So please make sure, first off, that you read the sample grant agreement. That's Appendix J of the implementation grant solicitation before submitting an application. The sample grant agreement includes the grantee's scope of work, which are all the duties and requirements that you'll need to complete within the grant term. It also includes some provisions that absolutely cannot change in the final grant agreement. Those are the items under sections J, oversight and accountability, K, project records, and N, general provisions. You need to make sure that you're okay complying with those requirements before you submit an application. As I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, staff will post the Q&A document that covers everything that we covered in this meeting today and send an email to notify all of the attendees, all of the registrants of the webinar when it's been posted. The solicitation says that the Q&A document will be posted within 3 business days or by early next week. We'll try to get it posted by that time, but it may take a little bit longer. We only have one more applicant Q&A session for the STEP solicitation. That takes place on August 13th at 3 p.m. and that's for both the implementation grant and the planning and capacity building grant combined. CARB staff will not respond to any questions after the final applicant teleconference has taken place on August 13th. You can email in questions for that applicant teleconference anytime up to 3 business days before the teleconference. The deadlines for that are all in the solicitation materials. Applications are due on August 31st, 2020 by 5 p.m. Pacific time. So please note that applications must be delivered to the physical address or the email address provided in the solicitation by that deadline. That includes hand-delivered applications and applications submitted by a delivery service provider. So I think that's it for us. Thanks for your interest in STEP and have a good evening.